As you know, brethren, there's been these slanderous words against Mr. Armstrong and the former worldwide Church of God, how supposedly the worldwide Church of God denied people medical care, how supposedly the church forbade consulting doctors and so on. But this is not true. The church always taught that first and primary faith when it comes to healing and health should be in God. And that any medical problem we might have, we should first, consult, we should first pray to God, we should ask for the elders to anoint us. That should be our first reaction. And then, of course, if any kind of medical intervention is needed, yes, all the members were free to consult doctors. However, some people, out of their personal faith, their conscience bothered them to consult with doctors, because as you know, much of the pharmacy does have its roots in paganism. But medical science has evolved over the time. It's not only Medicare now. It's diagnosis, and there are other things in medical science. So medical science is not the same as it used to be. However, some people, out of their own conscience and because of their faith in God, refused to have medical care, and they died. They just relied on divine healing. Divine healing didn't happen because God's will was different, and that was it. So why should anybody judge their faith? I don't know. I mean, they'll be the first resurrection. They'll be rewarded for their faith. I don't understand why should anybody judge them for their faith. But yes, there's some people who come up from time to time, and you can find some of those accusations on the internet, how the church supposedly denied medical care to its members. Now, I'm going to vindicate Mr. Armstrong and the church, because I'm going to be reading to you the notes from a lecture given sometimes at the end of the 60s. It was given to a chosen group of Ambassador College male students who were being prepared for the ministry, to be the ministerial assistants, to be the pillars of the church, perhaps even to be deacons and elders. So there was this class, an ambassador, and they had this special training on how to serve church members. So I'm going to read from those notes, and then you judge yourself what the church taught. Because if these men were taught this way, that means that the church has always practiced this, the old former WCG, Worldwide Church of God. Nowadays, in the continuing Church of God, brethren, we are extremely blessed, and I keep emphasizing that, and I cannot emphasize it enough, because we live in an even more dangerous age now, with pollution, all kinds of hormones, all kinds of biological warfare. This COVID-19 might be actually a biological warfare, with all kinds of other threats. We live with soil which is completely, basically worn out. So it is very important that nowadays in the continuing Church of God, the overseer, the leading man, is the doctor. He's the doctor of the natural medicine, which is a wonderful blessing. Wonderful blessing. He has his own business. He doesn't, as you know, he does not take any salary from the church. All the church funds have been distributed to those needy ones around the world. And therefore, we have a great, wonderful, blessing from God in that way. So now, again, the times have changed. But nevertheless, let us vindicate Mr. Armstrong and the WCG by what I'm just going to go through with you. The title of that lecture was "How to Deal with Health and Medical Problems." All right. So the first area is advising on health problems. That was the lecture to the ambassador students in the 60s. And now listen to this. Caution must always be exercised in advising on a person's health problems, lest you be found to be practicing medicine. Don't put people on diets and fasts. What constitutes the practice of medicine is much broader than one would ordinarily think. Some of the general definitions given by the courts are as follows, and here is the first quote. The practice of medicine as contemplated and defined by law is not restricted to treatment of disease and disorders of the human body by use of drugs and surgery. The practice of medicine may be said to consist of three things. First, in judging the nature, character, and symptoms of the disease. Second, in determining the proper remedy for the disease. And third, in giving or prescribing the application of the remedy to the disease. It is not limited to attempts to treat by medicine or surgery, but includes those who practice neither medicine nor surgery in any of its departments, but who profess to cure and who treat or attempt to treat the sick by means other than medicine or surgery. Now, in that further lecture, then it says, some cases of practicing medicine even touch upon the realm of divine healing and anointing with oil. In New York, it was stated, here is a quote, a Christian science healer who holds himself as able to heal diseases by prayer to God and accepts compensation for his services and is engaged in the practice of medicine. Now, as you know, we don't have any compensation for services of that kind anyway, brethren, and as you know, as far as I'm informed by Dr. Thiel, he is over 90% of his cases have been very successfully treated by using natural means, and certainly by prayer and certainly by anointing. But merely praying for sick is permissible, according again to New York, because here is a quote from back those days. Prayer for those suffering from disease, or words of encouragement, or the teaching that disease will disappear and physical perfection be attained as a result of prayer, or that humanity will be brought into harmony with God and the fixed determination to look on the bright side of life, does not constitute the practice of medicine in the popular sense. Faith healer treating patients by laying on hands without diagnosis or promise of cure, held not engaged in the practice of medicine and surgery. End of the quote. Now, in the lecture then, the question was asked to the ambassador students, what is the penalty for practicing medicine? Is it merely a few dollar fine? And the answer was no, it is much more than that. If a person practices medicine without a license and the patient should die, the wrongdoer could be prosecuted for manslaughter or murder. So this was the official teaching of the church, brethren. Now you can see, then the lecture continues, you can see why extreme caution must be exercised in advising brethren in God's church concerning their health problems. You can and should teach them to study and live by the 7 laws of radiant health. We used to have a booklet entitled The 7 Laws of Radiant Health. There was later other book, The Principles of Healthful Living was entitled in its later edition. So yes, Mr. Armstrong always was zealously preaching that we should live healthy. And yes, according to some reports, brethren, we went even to extremes. Sometimes before we get a balanced approach, we go to extremes. We do it in our personal lives, we do it as church organizations. So, at one point, using white sugar was forbidden for church members, and it was even the basis to be disfellowshipped. I heard that there were ministers going around members' home to inspect whether they had, white sugar in their homes. That's how zealous we were sometimes for the health. And we should be zealous for the health even to this day. I don't use white sugar anymore, and I believe any of you don't use white sugar anymore. We try to do, and live by those healthy principles. But, we are not to go to the extreme. Sometimes we live in an imperfect world, and sometimes you don't really know what might happen. Let me give you an illustration. For many times in one of the cities of Serbia where I lived, for 7 years, we didn't realize that various bakeries were using lard rather than oil for their products. Because, oil was supposed to be used, but, many of those Serbian bakers, by the way, because we've got Albanian bakers and others who may not be Serbs, and their bakery, we thankfully have one in our town, so we know that his food is being made, without any pork. But, the lard is cheaper, and therefore they were just using lard, of course, illegally, because they were supposed to be using cooking oil, but they were using lard, and we didn't know that. We discovered that only after several years of my life in that town. And then I found another bakery where, it was held by Albanians, by the way, and they didn't use lard, so it was a big blessing. So, but sometimes you don't really know. We live in an imperfect world. People can cheat on us. We sometimes don't know. So we can, it's not our business to be concerned about things that we don't know, or that people may just do things illegally for us. Then, in those cases, we have to rely on God's supernatural protection. And, we have to be faithful. That's what it says, that we'll pick up snakes and drink poisons and they will not harm us. It doesn't mean that we are not going to be drinking poisons left and right, but sometimes we don't really know what is happening. I'm thinking about this vaccination. Thankfully, it seems that they will not make it mandatory for all the population because of this COVID-19. But even if they made it mandatory, brethren, even if they did, I said to the Serbian congregation, I'm telling you this to you, even if they make us take those vaccines, and we do suspect, certainly without any I mean, I have no doubts that we don't really know what those vaccines are and what kind of elements they might be, what kind of experiments they might be. So even though they may even force us to take those vaccines, we should still be, we should still have faith in God that God will just neutralize whatever harm those vaccines might do to us. So we need to be, be faithful, be balanced, and we need not fear what men can do to us. I know it's easier said than done, but I've been thinking about these things since I myself just don't want to have those vaccines. I don't trust them. I don't trust the pharmaco mafia myself, and I know that all of you probably don't trust them either. But what if they make us do certain things? Well, we should just remain faithful to God and rely on Him. Anyway, so the thing is that we used to have that always. We used to have a great emphasis on healthful living. We used to have a booklet, and this is what it was referring to in this lecture. That there was that booklet was called, 7 Laws of Radiant Health once upon a time, sometimes in the 60s, and the students were referred to live by those laws. You can teach them, continues the lecture, them, the brethren, the church members, you can teach them the truth of the Bible concerning faith and healing, but don't put them on diets or fasts. Let them decide that, you see. And it was always up to personal decision, brethren. You could recommend they go to a good doctor. Listen to this one, part of the lecture. You could recommend they go to a good doctor or specialist for a physical checkup if they want detailed advice on their physical health problems. Now, brethren, I'm telling you the official position of the church. This was taught to the ambassador students. So you tell me whether this is against doctors or no. We were primarily against the poisons in medicine and pharmaco products because we cannot really trust them, and we were always on the side of natural things. Mr. Armstrong was on the side of natural things. Dr. Thiel is certainly on the side of natural things. He's doctor of natural medicine. I'm on the side of natural things always. But we never, we have never forbidden members to consult with the doctors to see and make checkup on their health and get the diagnosis. We have never forbidden that. I'm telling you, this is lecture from the 60s, the end of the 60s. Sometimes this is advisable and helpful. Of course it is. Then it continues, never tell a member not to go to a doctor or hospital. Don't tell them not to take their sick children. And also, don't tell them to stop taking a medicine they might be relying upon. It is their decision to make. So again, the emphasis was on personal responsibility and personal decision. And just as I said to you, some people decided they didn't want any medicine. They didn't care about doctor's intervention. They just put their complete trust in God and they wanted to be divinely healed. Some of them died because God didn't allow it to happen the way that they had for whatever reason, but their faith still remained. They were faithful to the end of their lives. They'll be in the first resurrection, and I'm sure God will reward them greatly for their faithfulness. But the church never taught, as you see, the church always taught personal responsibility and never taught that we should be deterring members from hospitals and doctors. Now, it says later, you can anoint, if you're an elder, and pray for them. You can try to strengthen their faith and encourage them to trust God, but don't tell them what to do. You could be held legally responsible and persecuted if they die. So I'm telling you the official teachings of the church and ambassador back in the 60s, brethren. The second area about the health and medical problems is how prosecution begins in case of death. So of course there were members who didn't want to have medicine, didn't want to have medical intervention, and of course they would invite a minister or an elder to be anointed, and it might happen that they were at their deathbed and they invited a minister, so a minister might have been there at the moment when they died. So this was now advice what to do about legal possible problems. But again, keep in mind, no member was told not to go to hospital. No member was told that if he's taking a medicine, to leave it. This was the official teachings of the church. So how prosecution begins in case of death, says now this lecture. In order to act wisely in a case where a person dies, it is helpful to know how such cases come to be prosecuted. How does the district attorney's office even become acquainted with information? Such information can come to them through a complaint by anyone that knew a doctor was not called or medical aid refused, such as a neighbor who was previously told about a parent's religious beliefs, a relative who happened to be visiting, or from any other similar source. It may also come through more official channels, such as facts gleaned by police or fire officials called in as members of a respiratory squad. So obviously, back in those days, there was a fire members called as a respiratory squad. Nowadays, we have a totally different Medicare, but I'm again telling you what was the teaching, official teaching of the church, brethren. So it was back then in the 60s, so it's of course relates to situation back in those days. Also, it says, if no doctor signs the death certificate, generally speaking, the coroner's department will hold an inquest to determine the cause of death. This will most likely bring out the fact that no doctor was called. Such a fact would be a red light to the district attorney. Generally speaking, when these cases come before the district attorney, he has the discretion as to whether or not he will prosecute. As this type of case is not so well known as the obvious type of crime such as murder and robbery, there is always the possibility that he might choose not to prosecute. This is the type of circumstances where a contact is invaluable. A contact under quotation mark. The prosecutor might easily be persuaded by a friend to drop the matter so long as the newspapers have not made major news of it. The fear along this line is that the case will fall into the hands of a newly appointed assistant district attorney. Such men are customarily extremely zealous. They want to make a name for themselves. Now, in the third area of this lecture, there was suggestions for avoiding prosecution. And so here what it says. The following suggestions, although by no means a guarantee, will definitely aid in avoiding prosecutions and notoriety in the event a death should ensue from other than natural means. Number 1, don't say anything. This is the first and foremost rule in every criminal case. The importance of this one rule cannot be overemphasized. Avoid telling anyone how long the person was sick. Avoid telling anyone that you knew the person was seriously ill. Avoid telling anyone when the illness first became serious. Don't mention divine healing. The general rule of not saying anything, like all others, has its qualifications. If a person would absolutely refuse to answer every casual question of inquiry, it could result in a full-blown investigation. But is this so bad? Even if an investigation is held, if it can turn up no detrimental facts, there is no problem. On the other hand, if the person does speak and does give the right answer, you can perhaps ward off an investigation. But if you do speak and say the wrong thing, then your statement could be the very basis of a successful prosecution. Remember, there is absolutely nothing that a state official is going to be asking about that is going to be to your benefit. The only information he's going to be seeking is not information to free you, but information to prosecute you. Always keep in mind that everything you say that is detrimental will be fed right back to you in court. In the initial investigation of the case, a little tact in refusing to answer these questions would be highly beneficial. To state, quote, I'm not going to answer any questions. I don't have to. I know my constitutional rights, would obviously only serve to clash with the carnal mind. Some practical reasons should be thought of, such as the parent merely saying, please sir, I'm just not in mood to talk to anyone or answer any questions. Please just leave my wife and me alone. If you are just a witness, there is no better way out than the old time-worn cliche. Quote, look, I just don't want to get involved. End of the quote. Remember, if circumstances become pressing and time is needed, never forget the famous statement, quote, I'm sorry, but my attorney has instructed me never to say anything under circumstances like this until I've had a chance to talk to him first. End of the quote. Secondly, if legal circumstances or wisdom demands that you answer, then be succinct and discreet. Keep in mind that the officials don't know everything you know, and the little they do know, they really don't fully comprehend. Too often, an investigator will just strike out blindly, acting as though he has all the facts, and the victim will just spill the beans, so to speak. If the investigator should know something about anointing with oil, there is no need to assume that he knows that the practice of medicine is held in disrepute. It might be good to draw an analogy to the Catholic Church and the fact that we, as they, anoint with oil. Make a statement like that. That was advice to the ambassador's students. When one minister at the scene of a death was abruptly asked by an investigating officer, "Who are you?" he simply replied, "A friend." No further questions were asked. If you are known to be a minister and asked why you are there, a general answer that might suffice would be, "I just came to perform my general ministerial duties of offering spiritual encouragement and as a family friend." Do not mention faith healing under any circumstances. It cannot be introduced during the trial as a defense. It will only serve to raise antagonisms at the time of the inquiry and make the whole case newspaper worthy. It can always be brought up later if it is to the person's advantage. Deny any knowledge that the ailment was serious, or if this cannot be done, then A. Place the time when the seriousness first became apparent as close to the time of death as possible. B. Take the shortest period of time possible for the length of the illness. C. If the question of a doctor should arise, it might be met with, "If I had any idea that she was that sick and that a doctor could have healed her, I certainly would have called him immediately." End of the quote. The third thing, befriend a doctor with at least an affinity for our religious beliefs. The calling of a doctor during the last stages of a very serious illness could work for good or for evil from the legal point of view. On the one hand, if he were called in soon enough to ascertain the cause of death and was of a friendly attitude, he might sign the death certificate and thereby avoid any coroner's inquest. On the other hand, a doctor might recommend some course of medical treatment that he feels would absolutely save the person's life, but which we would consider absolutely inimical to God's laws. If the person died, then the doctor would be a powerful witness for the prosecution, not only to prove gross neglect, but proximate cause as well. Also, unless the doctor held an affinity for our religious beliefs, he could contact the district attorney if the patient was a minor and request that a court-appointed guardian be named. The court could then take custody of the child and the guardian consent to such a course of medical treatment. The worthwhile physical knowledge that a doctor does have to offer should be taken into consideration and, depending upon the circumstances, weigh heavily in favor of consulting or calling one in. The fourth point, when rejecting medical service on drugs, predicate the refusal on the grounds of risk of or potential adverse results. One of the most practical and valuable ways of rejecting certain medical services or drugs is, you see, that was the issue, brethren. We were basically against the drugs, taking drugs and being prescribed treatments with things that could be poisonous or detrimental. So, one of the most practical and valuable ways of rejecting certain medical services or drugs is to base the objection on the ground of risk. A procedure might be to ask a doctor, what are the chances of the operation being a failure? What are the chances of it being useless? What are the chances of it being harmful? What are the chances the drug will have an adverse reaction, etc.? Now, why this big deal about operations, brethren, or surgery as we call it today? Well, the big deal is that the doctors usually, at least that is our experience here in Serbia, usually if you have some growth on your skin or whatever kind of disorder, the first that they basically say, well, let's just cut it, just go for an operation. What is wrong with that? Well, the wrong thing with that is, brethren, that many times those things could be treated naturally, of course, and with prayer and anointing, and they could be treated naturally, and they could be just resolved without any operation or surgery or any organ being removed. So that's the point, you see. That's the point, and again, our experience here shows that, yes, I understand when cancer is involved and some other lethal diseases, medical surgery is, of course, advisable. It has to be removed. But, there are other things that might happen, and the first thing that the doctors want to do is, as we say in Serbia, put us under the knife. So that was That was about the operations, and of course about the taking medical pills and stuff. We were always against it because we realized it's not natural. It's all artificial, and we don't really know how many poisons are there. Anyway, back to the lecture. If the doctor should remark the odds are 70 to 30 in favor of success or lack of any adverse reaction, the patient or parent can meditatively contemplate the answer. He could then state, I just don't feel I should take the chance. It just seems it would be better off to do whatever else we could and then let nature take its course. End of the quote. If the matter is serious enough and the particular doctor sees no possibility of adverse effect but only 100% success, then the patient or parent can merely state that they would like to obtain further consultation and advice on the subject. It is almost always possible to find other medical advice which would take a contrary position. It can be contended then that the adverse consultation was relied upon. You see, and this was a very wise, and I can tell you, brethren, a balanced advice. Because, look at with this COVID-19, we keep receiving contradictory information from all over the world. Nowadays, we no longer do we know what to believe and who to really trust. Yes, we understand there is pandemic. Yes, we do understand that it's taking toll. Some of our actors have died already. Some of the musicians in Serbia have died, and around the world, various public figures have died. Yes, we understand it's a real thing. We don't understand how does it work. How do we get How do we get it? How do we contract that? It's nowadays it seems to be almost being contracted even by the air. So what can you do? We cannot stop breathing and things like that. So what this advice was saying is that the doctors usually just out of their whims or because they have certain commission from certain pharmaceutical companies, as is the case today, would distribute those drugs, vaccines and stuff. So the advice was seek some other medical advice. And back in it will be in the 19th century, in America used to have plenty of herbalists, people who were just picking up the natural herbs. I forgot now what was the exact word for those people, but anyway in English, but I know what is the word in Serbian. So those are the people using medicinal herbs, and they were just from those medicinal herbs. They knew there were people in Serbia as well back in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and even today there are few who remain, several individuals, who pick up those medicinal herbs and they just make various teas and various balms that can be used for treatment of various ailments. Now that was the advice of the church. There might be always some other alternative, and in our case we are now very blessed because we do have an alternative. We have a doctor of natural medicine whom we can consult and visit and rely upon because he is a godly person. It's Dr. Thiel. So we are tremendously blessed now. The church wasn't that much blessed in the past, but the church nevertheless did have doctors and nurses. When I was a student and ambassador, we had a health center. Bob Harrington was the head of the health center. So yeah, we had a medical staff there indeed, because it was certainly required by the law, no wonder, but we did have medical staff nevertheless. So we didn't shun away from medicine and hospitals and doctors all the way. We just tried to avoid being poisoned and being misused and abused by the pharmacomafia. And there was nothing wrong with that. The fifth point was keep knowledge of illness restricted to as few people as possible. During the steps when an illness becomes serious, keep as many people out of the house as possible. Do not tell outsiders about the seriousness of an illness or your belief in divine healing. The more people that have knowledge of the subject or are present during the final stages, the more potential adverse witnesses you have. Final stage, so it means those who refuse medical care, they just put their trust in God. They were in the final stages now, and they're about to die. So they might again call upon a minister to be anointed. They might call for some final words. They might call a minister to say goodbye to the minister. Those are the advices what to do in case that the legal system may try to implicate that you have committed a manslaughter. The more people that have knowledge of the subject or are present during the final stages, the more potential adverse witnesses you have. Only one antagonistic person with a sufficient amount of first-hand knowledge can furnish enough testimony upon which to pass a successful prosecution. It should also be considered that when a fire department respiratory squad is called, it is generally customary that the police are also notified. This, of course, should not in any way deter the calling of such help if it appears they might save such a life. However, a private ambulance service which maintains oxygen and respiratory equipment might be kept on file and utilized when needed rather than the public services. So again, using medical care and medical help was not forbidden. And nobody was put out of the church for using doctors or hospitals or even medicine, brethren. The church had a very balanced stance because it was trying to save people's physical lives in a natural way, but the church also tried to teach people to first and foremost have faith in God and divine healing. And is there something wrong about that? The sixth point was, do not attend an informal requested hearing at the district attorney's office unless unusual circumstances dictate otherwise. A strong general rule is that a parent should never go to the office of the district attorney to discuss such a case. If circumstances should for some reason require him to attend, then under no circumstances should he go without an attorney. Another fact is very important. In one case, the prosecutor admitted that he could never have tried the case without the statements given by the mother. After the child had died, she stopped in his office at his request and told him everything about the case. She even signed a statement to that effect. She also made statements to certain officials in the coroner's office. They proved certain facts that he could not have proven otherwise. You see, that's how we can be unwise when we rely on the world system, brethren. So like this mother did, probably naive as she was, because the world system, of course, doesn't want to praise us for our faith in God. The world system wants to prosecute and make our lives bitter, and make our lives as difficult as possible. That's the world system. This is the Satan's world around. That was the point that Mr. Armstrong was trying to drive in people's mind. This is the Satan's. He kept going back to the Garden of Eden, to the two trees, to the first choice, to the first humans. Brethren, I cannot emphasize enough that this is Satan's world, and we often, I'm afraid, forget about it. Just like people did forget in the 20th century. The point was to tell them they need to have faith in God, not in the worldly system of medicine, you see. Yes, we can use, of course, the worldly system of medicine. Medicine now has advanced to totally different levels. With this laser treatment, I'm very excited about the laser treatment that can now remove bladder stones and do other wonders. That's marvelous. Back in those days, it wasn't the case. Back in those days, they would just operate you, even if the operation wasn't needed. Back in those days, they would just prescribe you all sorts of medicine of who knows whatever origin. And that was what the church was cautious about. But the point was always that we remember that we are dealing with a world system that is godless. The medicine, brethren, what is the medicine? It is, pharmacy. It's based on paganism. What can you expect from these doctors? What would you expect from doctors and nurses and medical staff who are educated in evolution, who do not believe in anything divine? Let me just remind you of one thing that you and I know, that all those doctors have no idea about, brethren. That the science has no idea, that the religion doesn't preach. We know about, for example, what is the integral part of our human life. It is the spirit of man. The spirit of man, that is a divine revelation given to us. And the Church of God is the only religious group, so to speak, that preaches that. The science doesn't know that. Doctors have no clue about that. So the point that the church always was trying to do is that we must remember that God is above that system, and that, those godless people there who are being brought up to believe in evolution and godless principles, they just would have godless approach to any healing. The point was that we should first and foremost have faith in God, and of course use the medicine if it would be beneficial, just as we have just read. Use the private ambulance. If the life can be saved, yes, use it. But keep in mind, God is always there. His will is above all of that. That was the point. And perhaps that's the point that we need to keep emphasizing now in these days more than ever, because in this technologically advanced age, we're far more prone now to rely upon all these gadgets and this technological and medical advancement. Now again, the medicine has changed drastically, so it's not only prescription of drugs. You see, there are laser treatments, there are now surgeries, very complicated surgeries. We have here in Serbia one of the best surgeons in the world. They have performed very complicated surgeries of hearts and stuff, and that's great. But you know what? If any of you get ill or need to have a surgery, and if some of you refuse because you just don't want to be in the hands of the godless medicinal staff, I would understand you, brethren. I would understand you, and that's your choice, personal choice. Again, as church taught, or has always taught, it's personal choice. If you choose not to be treated, that's your personal choice, and I believe that God will honor your choice and your faith in Him, whether you get healed divinely or not. The seventh point was, don't involve the church. Beware of advising people and involving the church. People are free moral agents and must make their own decisions. How many times it has been emphasized in this lecture, see? So again, the members were free moral agents. Some of them didn't want medical treatment, some of them refused to call doctors, some of them died in faith. I hail those who did it because they did it out of faith. I admire them. And they'll be in the first resurrection, and they were faithful to the end. And God is going to honor that. Of course, in the world to come, there will be no hospitals and no doctors. And there will be no illnesses, probably, as far as we can read in the Bible. But right now, we live in this day and age when, yes, we are subjected to pollution. We're subjected to all kinds of factors that threaten our health. And again, all of us are free moral agents, and we must make our own decision. The church always taught that. The church will always continue to teach that. They must learn to stand on their own feet. Well, brethren, let me tell you, I've taken this advice when it comes to doctrinal matters. I want all of you and myself, because we don't know, the famine of the word is coming. I would love all of us to be able to stand on our own feet doctrinally as well, to be firmly grounded in the Bible doctrines, that nothing can move us from it. And let me once again this is of course the topic is medical problems and how to deal with health, but let me just insert one comment, brethren. When the beast power rises, it's going to get more difficult. And the famine of the word, we don't exactly know when it may start. But we already see censorship, so we already have the overlords to the famine of the world, brethren. I want us, and I hope by that when it starts, that we'll be able to stand on our own feet. And when the beast power rises, the Laodicean churches of God will most likely turn even more antagonistic against us, because they don't understand it will be the beast. When he starts with the false miracles, they would not recognize it, because they will expect the Pope to start with those false signs and miracles. They don't understand it's a civil leader, and there is a potential that many of us, or some of us, may betray God of the Bible and turn against Him, or turn against the Philadelphian remnant of the church. We have to be aware of that, and we need, hopefully, by the time before the beast rises, you see, we have been trying to grow in grace and knowledge, enough so that we'll be able to stand on our own feet. So now back to this health and medicinal problem. The point was, don't involve the church. The church must come before individuals. Don't make the church responsible for lawsuits. Help people in order to protect the church, but let people help themselves where possible. Don't try to live their lives for them. Don't obligate the church. So everybody was having free moral agents. The same will happen when the beast rises. The church cannot dictate faith to any of us and faithfulness to any of us, brethren. So be prepared and be notified in advance. Once the beast appears, you'll see how the mood of the Laodicean churches toward us will change. And it'll be very difficult for some of us also not to turn away from God. So be prepared and be watchful, be vigilant, and pray to God that we will not fall into that category. Because there are prophecies about that. They will betray one another, it says. Jesus Christ said. It's a horrendous prophecy. Those are the most prophecies that really scare me more than anything else. I'm more scared about the church, prophecies about the church, including those ones about people believing unsound doctrines. I'm more scared about, and the love of many, or in some translations as most growing cold. I'm more scared, brethren, about those prophecies about the church than I'm scared about the prophecies about the world. And I keep constantly, I live in a sort of a apprehension, would I be the one who would fulfill that prophecy? And we need to keep thinking about that. Hopefully, if we think about it, and hopefully if we pray fervently to God in zeal that He would spare us from that, then I'm sure God will respond to our prayers. If we don't care about it, if we just live naively thinking that things will always be as easy and something like that can never happen to us, there are great chances that it might happen to us. Don't be hostile toward doctors and hospitals was part of this lecture. Don't be hostile toward doctors and hospitals. When brought into contact with medical men, be friendly but firm. Be careful not to mention the Bible, religion, or the Church of God. The fourth area of this lecture, given back in the 60s, was what to do in case of an untimely death. Untimely death. When there is an untimely death in the church with overtones of divine healing having been relied upon, prompt action is necessary in order to avoid prosecution and bad publicity. Therefore, here is the procedure to follow. 1. In the event of an untimely death of any member or prospective member or one of their children, and it is under any circumstances other than that which would be considered absolutely normal in the world's eyes, for example, in the hospital, a doctor in general attendance with basically full medical aid being given, etc., the local minister should immediately contact headquarters by telephone and notify us of the circumstances, which would include the names and telephone numbers of all persons either directly involved or witnesses. And 2. After receiving this information, either Mr. and then there are 2 names here mentioned, they were working for the legal department of the church, they can consult with the local minister by telephone and ascertain if there is potential criminal liability or bad publicity for the church member, the minister, or the church. If so, one of them may need to fly to the area and personally question and counsel parties involved. Now, nowadays we don't have to worry about that anymore, but back in those days I had to worry about that. So this was part of the lecture. And the 5th and the last area was prevention is the best cure. Yeah, that was, would you consider that to be a sound attitude, brethren? Would you consider that to be a sound doctrine? Prevention is the best cure. And hear what it says. Remember to instruct the church members ahead of time on the principles of health and measures to prevent serious illnesses. Increasingly, we need to drill them on this type of general health and diet information so that they can decide what to do in case of sickness without the minister constantly having to suggest nearly every step they take. Teach them to truly glorify God in their bodies. This is part of the direct gospel commission. Also teach them the truth about the deep, living faith in God so that they will automatically trust Him when a crisis comes. That was the point, brethren. Automatically trust God when a crisis comes. And putting that on this another level, the crisis is going to come for the church in general when the beast power finally takes seat over in Europe, over here in Europe. A major crisis, and then you will see what crisis that will be. Then again, we are continuing now about this lecture. The minister won't have to be constantly suggesting or encouraging measures of faith at a time when legally they ought to be dedicating on their own without the church having to be directly involved. We cannot legislate the degree of faith for people to exercise in a crisis or any other time. And that was always the stance of the church. Now you may then ask, well, why doesn't Dr. Thiel intervene about some of the clamors on the forum? Why doesn't he do? Well, brethren, because he understands the principle that we cannot legislate the degree of faith for people to exercise in a crisis or any other time. All he can do is just point out the principles, teach people, encourage them to follow the principles. And if they don't want to, that's their own choice. They're free moral agents. And then it says in this prevention is the best cure area, do build that real understanding and faith ahead of time. Definitely have special sermons and Bible studies on health, diet, disease, and on how to trust in God for healing and without getting the church involved in legal disputes. Then, if legal problems arise, and far fewer should this way, follow the course outlined above and instruct all the members in this ahead of time as well. Brethren, this was lecture given back in the 60s to a chosen group of ambassador students who are supposed to be teaching, preaching, and helping local church areas. As you can see, the church never forbade consulting doctor. The church never prevented members from taking even medicine, going for surgeries if that was their choice. The church only emphasized that we should have a deep and automatic faith in God in every crisis, be it health crisis or any other crisis. And I hope that with this message I've clarified, it certainly did clarify to me what was the official teaching of the church. It clarified hopefully to you what was the official teaching of Mr. Armstrong and the WCG. And it certainly has refuted now all those who falsely accuse Mr. Armstrong and the church that they knowingly and willingly killed almost people by denying them or preventing them to consult doctors. That's simply not the truth. So let us have deep, and hopefully through our experience we'll have deep and automatic faith in God in any crisis that might arise. We've just had a very small minor crisis, you might say, that happened now on Sunday, but as far as I can see, we're taking very firm stand and good stand, and we're faithful to God. We're not being dismayed, we're not being offended. We do understand that there are Satan workers around. Satan has got, of course, all the all the pharmaceutical companies and all these medicine personnel under his control. No wonder Satan has got people who are directly attacking some of us personally, but that's to be expected, brethren. So let us continue to grow and have faith in God in any crisis. And I hope that this short lecture about the health and medicine or relying on medicine was useful to you also for your own personal choices.